So we're now at the bottom of page 3. We're going to finish up the addendum KW in this video. It'll take us probably 8 to 10 minutes. So the next clause is if it's new construction. So again, as I mentioned at the very first part of this video series, that the addendum KW really was bringing in clauses that we found in practice we couldn't find anywhere else. So that's where you would go to the addendum KW. So new construction says buyer and seller shall meet within blank days of acceptance to determine specifications, landscaping, blah, blah, blah. This specifically is with the builder, right? So if you've got a buyer who wants to work with the builder and for example, the buyer wants to tie up a lot or get an accepted offer on a lot, yet they don't want to be committed to the lot until they have the opportunity to sit down with the builder and get plans and specs, at least a certain sense of it, then you would include this addendum or this contingency with this one, the subject to building contract. So again, putting those two together so that that's protecting your buyer if they're thinking about new construction. They've identified a lot they'd like. They want to make sure no one else buys a lot while they're getting all their ducks in a row from a construction perspective. The next two are pre-check boxes about lien waivers. Again, this goes back to new construction only with the lien waivers. It's the seller shall disclose no later than 3 days prior to closing all work performed on the property within 6 months prior. Actually, not specific to new construction, to any construction or work done. It's the seller warrants that all work is paid in full. Now, why do we have that in there? Because in Wisconsin, if someone provides a service to a property, meaning to a home or a property, and they don't get paid, they do, if they did everything correctly in the way they set up the job, they have the right to file a lien against the property. A lien against the property stays with the property, it doesn't go with the owner. So whoever signed that contract closes and moves on, that lien sits there, it's now the new owner's responsibility. So that's what this is covering, and that's why we've got it pre-checked so that if we ever run into that, we can always go back and get this settled between buyer and seller because you used an addendum KW and it was there. Rental weatherization, actually, that's gone away, and in the updates we're going to do to addendum KW, this will get taken out. It can stay in there if you want to be totally technical. You can strike through it. I just leave it for now. Next one, though, talks about test and contingency. So here's one that, if you remember in the WB11, it talks about inspection is not testing. So this language is if the buyer specifically wants to do some sort of testing and make it contingent in the offer. The one we see more often than not is radon, and that is a test. If it's so that's why it's here for you. And so you read through it. The language is very similar to all the other contingencies. We get to the blank. We want to be specific about the type of test. And again, quite often, the one that we see more often than not is radon. And so let's say we choose that. Let me spell it right. And it says within blank days of acceptance. Now, if there's nothing put in here, 21 days is the default. What I like to do with radon is keep it consistent with inspection, and that was 21 days. So we'll do that. And you have to strike there with whose expense. Again, think about from a negotiating strategy what makes sense. In the market of the moment, it's probably buyer that pays for it. Goes on to say that it's going to be satisfied unless within 5 days of the earlier of the buyer's receipt of the testing report or the deadline for delivery reports to the listing broker if listed a copy of the testing report and a written notice of the defects in which the buyer objects. So again, we got to go back to these deadlines and dates, and then we've got to make sure we give notice. Now, let's say that we do have a radon test. It's on day 10. It comes back, and it reads high. And high would be anywhere above 4.0 picocuries per liter. Picocuries per liter is how they measure that. And so that is considered a defect. So now we're going to determine whether we want the seller to have the right to cure it or not. So again, just like the inspection contingency, if the seller doesn't have the right to cure, all the buyer would need to do when the defect comes back is give notice, and the offer's null and void. In this one, though, I do like to give the seller the right to cure, especially if it's radon, because that's typically not a super expensive cure, and yet it's one that the seller more than likely is going to have to deal with anyway now that they have knowledge of it. And so on this one, I do like to give the seller the right to cure. So I just want to make sure that we're clear about that. So I'm going to strike through the shall not. So if they have the right to cure, they may satisfy the contingencies by one, delivering to buyer within blank days of the buyer's delivery of the notice stating election to cure. So again, on that one, I'm going to keep that shorter. I'm going to go 5 days on that, just like we did with the inspection back on page 1 and 2. And then they have to cure it. and then they have to deliver a report showing the work was done 3 days prior to closing. So again, very similar language to the inspection contingency. It goes on to say the offer is null and void, and if the buyer makes delivery of notice of defects and the written report, and the seller does not have the right to cure, right? So we didn't give them the right to cure, or they have the right to cure, but they choose not to cure, or they don't timely deliver written notice of election to cure. So then it kills the deal. And we went on to get specific about radon test standards. So it's here. It says if the buyer elects to have a radon test, the definition of a defect shall include any radon gas levels above 4.0 picocuries per liter or higher. If the seller has a right to cure, seller shall satisfy the radon contingency by, and it goes on to talk about it, that they get a qualified professional to install radon remediation system that lowers the levels in the area tested to at least 4.0 or less. And then they provided the buyer that they did that, and then also confirmation that it's the readings are that. So it's a new test reading. So that's just it, and that's the testing contingency. Now there's other things they might choose to test. If it's the house was built prior to 1978, you would include an addendum S, and in there it allows for the inspection for lead-based paint. So that wouldn't be in this contingency. Yet you'd want to make sure you use an addendum S for that. Sometimes it might be there could be some mold that you've seen as you look at the property, and you want to have it tested, make sure it's not black mold. Those are the kinds of things that typically come up. All right. The next are a whole series of pre-typed underground storage tanks. Just talk about how those get dealt with. Very straightforward language there. You can read it. Above ground storage tanks, same way. Now, you don't typically run into those very often inside the villages or the cities, although you might. It's typically out on more rural settings that you'll see that. And if you do, you definitely want to follow the language here and make sure that your buyer's protected. Then it just goes on to say personal property listed in the offer is in working order and has no value unless specific value is assigned. That kind of covers two things. One, it's saying that it does work, and number two, it says for the sake of an appraisal that it doesn't, it's not part of the value of the property, and so we don't have to go back and make an amendment to an offer that states that. Then you got a few lines for anything else you want to cover, and then addendums only require initials. So then you get your buyer's initials and the seller's initialing. Now, the seller initialing the addendum doesn't mean that they agree with everything in the addendum. It's just meaning they acknowledge that it's there. And that's what this language says. It says, by initialing and dating, each party acknowledges they have received and carefully read all the pages of this addendum. Initialing by seller does not signify acceptance or agreement with the terms of the addendum. So what that means is that any one of these could still be negotiated in counteroffers. And so by the initialing doesn't mean that they're saying we agree to all of it. It's saying that they've acknowledged it. And so that's one of the points that gets a little confused with agents at times. Now that's the Addendum KW. Again, I recommend you use it, especially if you're working as a buyer's agent in every transaction. It's a catch-all for some things, and so I always would like to see that. If you are going to do that, you want to make sure that on the last line of your WB11, it does say we're including an Addendum KW, so it's referenced in the offer, and then we're in good shape. That's Addendum KW. Thanks for watching.